Hi, welcome to another Expert Insights discussion. Today we're joined by Stephanie Smith, founder and digital matriarch at Cogwheel Marketing. In this discussion, Stephanie outlines why she feels the ideology around the digital marketing budget needs to evolve. We consider the ecospheres in which a hotel exists, moving beyond rate shopping and production reports and focus more energy into online competitor analysis. And finally, looking at how the marketing audit provides the confidence to owners or investors that the budget has some depth of thought behind it, rather than the often used approach, let's add 5 to 10% on last year. I hope the discussion is of interest, and please feel free to comment below. We're always interested in your thoughts and views. And if you like what we're doing, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click that bell so you know when we have new content. And please don't forget a simple thumbs up. I know, but it really helps raise the profile of the channel. And in that way, you can help us to help others. Anyway, hope you enjoy it. Roll the intro. Hey, Stephanie, good to see you again. How are you? Are you well?
Everything's going good, Trevor. How are you?
Yep, very good indeed. Thank you. And I understand you're off on travels over the next week or so, events, conferences.
Yeah, 2 conferences. How exciting. So, and I'm presenting at both of them. So feel free to check them out after they're published.
Excellent. Well, we will certainly do that. Well, anything you have to say is always worth listening to. Hence why we've got you on here, of course. And the topic of today's discussion, well, I'll kind of lean into it a bit. So obviously, you from a digital marketing point of view, the budget season is kind of upon us. Our minds start to look towards 2022. And I guess following a year or probably 18 months where marketing spend has either stopped completely or has been significantly reduced, putting together a detailed marketing budget is going to be interesting, challenging, maybe are other words that we could use. And so I guess in a way, it would be quite tempting to dust off what we've done before, go back, reevaluate some numbers, maybe repeat the process now that things are starting to open up a little bit more. And with maybe limited time, limited staff, limited budgets, it might be easy to lean into something like that. But your advice, and you've written an article recently on this, and we'll make sure that the link is down in any notes that we put together. Your advice is before you even start thinking how much to spend, first of all, it's about where to spend it. And so your advice is to do a marketing audit first and foremost. Now, the word audit kind of sounds a bit dry and unexciting, but having read through the rationale behind it, it makes sense to me. So just maybe set it up for us. Why is an audit so important? Why are you saying that's the first step you should be taking?
Yeah, I think that, when we were doing, from a digital marketing standpoint, a lot of our budgeting is looking at from an expense line item standpoint. So you get a budget for your website, you get a budget for SEO, maybe Google AdWords, social media, and you have these kind of buckets that you're looking at. And then you would look at the budget over the course of 12 months and say, okay, maybe we spend more in low season and less in high season, to help shift share. And then you broke it out over 12 months. So I think the ideology around that has changed in terms of you're either in a position, depending on what type of hotel you are and what your ownership perspective is around spending money. You either have an owner that really leans into spend, or they're like, we have no money, where are you going to cut? So I think before you can say, like you mentioned, before you can say, how much am I going to spend? We have to say, let's make sure we're spending money in the right places.
Makes sense.
So that you're not, we work with a lot of portfolio management companies. They're like, okay, we want to do all this for all these hotels. But I think you really have to look at it on a much more smaller macro scale, because it doesn't, one hotel could be, doing really, really awesome on social media without the help of an agency, and the other one might be doing really well on Google search just based on the natural things that might have happened. So I I think that's where, before, and the audit it seems a little bit daunting, but when you look at all the different, and I'm going to use the term ecospheres that people can find out about you, you have to understand where you're positioned against your comp set before you start spending money.
So when we think about an audit, my mind automatically goes to like a financial audit. So, from a digital marketing perspective, there's obviously some things that there's some problems that you feel could be identified around that audit to help you start to frame, if I understand it correctly, to move forward, you've got to understand where some issues may be, look into it in a little bit more granular, because there are those limited budgets potentially, how you are using that and where you are spending that to get the best return you possibly can is most critical. So what are some of the problems that you feel by conducting an audit what are some of the problems that you feel can be identified or areas that would be flagged up?
Yeah, so I'm looking at it more again from an exposure standpoint. So how easy and how often are you showing up in Google searches? So I mean, obviously everyone's always doing different searches, but you can really drill down and say, okay, this is, these are where my weaknesses are, and try to put a plan against that.
Yeah.
Some of the other, obviously everyone, before you start spending money on OTAs, you need to look and say, what's your organic presence? And this is one I really struggle with, because hotels are like, or owners are like, okay, I'm going to give you $500 to spend on travel ads or something along those lines. And you're like, okay, well, one, do we need it? Like, what data points are we looking at to say, are we already performing well in Expedia? Are we getting our fair share? How's the comp set doing in terms of that Expedia production before we put the money there? Maybe we have decent exposure on Expedia and we need to put those funds somewhere else. So kind of going through that process and saying, looking at the total market, how much, some markets perform really well in Booking or go to Priceline and some don't. So, like, is that where you need to be spending your effort, depending on if that market produces via that channel and ecosphere?
That makes sense. Now, you've mentioned that word ecosphere a couple of times, and I know when we were talking about this before, you kind of identified in from your perspective, an ecosphere you sort of identify as 4 core areas. What are those sort of 4 areas that you look at? I mean, Google you've mentioned there, OTAs. What are a couple of other areas that when you talk about ecosphere?
So I think when we think about ecosphere, we're looking also at social media as a potential ecosphere. And then I think the other one, and this was kind of a weird one, but I would say I place even more greater importance on reviews and what that does to not only your conversion, but also your exposure and the impact that it has on getting in front of more eyes when you have that positive review.
Reviews. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And those, and as you said, a lot of those are interlinked, though, aren't they? I mean, particularly the review element. I think when we've spoken before, you were talking about being allocated budgets to spend in certain areas, but if a hotel has a poor review, it's almost counterproductive.
Absolutely. I mean, we've definitely been in scenarios where the reviews are so bad that we're just never seeing an ROI on the money that we spent. But it also relates to kind of, to your point, all those other places. So your reviews component impacts your exposure on Google, especially within that Maps ecosphere. It affects your OTA conversion in your placement, and especially if you're getting dinged for people having poor experiences, that reduces your overall exposure. So the reviews are definitely tied in, but it also has a direct impact on all those different things. I think that average person still looks at like 34 different sites, and that's what they're looking. A lot of times they are still looking at that reviews piece of it as it affects your exposure and conversion.
I've got you. And in terms of would an audit look at simple things such as content, images, the storytelling element? Is that something that an audit would would or should be picking up? Do you bring that into the equation?
Absolutely. I think that's kind of like what I consider more of a foundational piece, because you need to have a consistent story across all of your online channel, all those different ecospheres we talked about.
Yeah.
But the imagery can be quite subjective. Like I am going to look at it with a different lens than maybe an owner, but it still surprises me that there isn't that investment in photos like there should be.
Don't get me started on images on hotel websites.
But that's certainly part of the foundational piece that affects your exposure and again your conversion across all those different channels, even as much as having good images on your Google My Business to try to increase engagement, therefore increasing exposure within the maps listing. So like all of that goes into play. And then do you take it to the next step and start incorporating video and things like that? And that's where I think the other big kind of piece of the pie you have to look at in the audit is your comp set. So everything is relative. Everything in every market is relative. So if you, for example, if none of your hotels are really active on social media or none of your comp set, you either say it's an advantage for me to try to do so, try it, see if it works, or does it make sense to spend money elsewhere because we're all on a level playing field as far as that goes.
Now it's interesting. You use the terminology comp set, and then you spoke about are they active on social media? And a lot of times when you hear hoteliers talk about comp set, they're thinking about kind of rate shopping, the production reports, all those typical reports that we see coming out. Well, that doesn't include the social media side. So what you're referring to there, if I understood it correctly, is rather than that traditional competitor analysis that we're all familiar with, you're talking about it in the sense of online competitor analysis. Is that right?
Yeah, 1,000%. Because everyone, when I ask who your competitor, like we had a call with a full service hotel the other day, and they're like, oh, we've got 30,000 square feet of meeting space, and our comp set, has 20,000 square feet, and that's why they should stay with us. And I said, but that's completely irrelevant. I said, right now, in today's terms, you're competing against a select service hotel across the street. You're probably even it's a much more flat playing field, and especially Google really flattens that playing field. Even the OTAs, they don't take into consideration those attributes, and they make your online comp set much, much larger than your star comp set.
So what are ways, I guess we could look at it from two sides. I guess there's tools out there a bit like your star comp set that you can be using, but then if you don't have access to tools, there's maybe other approaches you can take. What can you tell us about that element?
Yeah, we use some tools, like from an SEO standpoint to look at backlinks and things like that. But if you don't have those tools, old-fashioned, just doing those searches, like an incognito mode on Google, but even just doing different searches on your OTAs to see where you rank, where your comp set ranks. What are they highlighting that's different than yours? What are they using for give thought to what are they using for their first image? What are they using for their primary image on Google? What are they using for their primary image on Expedia? So, those type of things you can do manually if you just kind of have the thought process and look at it with, more from a consumer's lens.
Yeah. And again, you mentioned social media. I don't know, maybe all hotels do it. Maybe all GMs or the marketing person in hotels are across all of their competitors' social media feeds. But that's a key area that you've highlighted probably 3 or 4 times in this discussion.
Well, there's actually a free tool out there. I can share the link after this for the recap. But there is a tool out there. You can actually see if your competitors are actively running Facebook ads.
Oh, right. Okay.
So it's just a URL that you plug it in. You drop your competitor's Facebook profile, and you can actually see if they're running ads. So it's kind of really, to see inside of who they're going after and things like that is pretty insightful, I think.
And I guess back to one of your earlier points on the reviews again, I guess looking at your comp set and the various areas where you can look at what reviews they're getting, yeah?
Well, and especially, I really hone in on the Google reviews because it's something that we have that you have control over, but you kind of have to ask for it. Like if you go, just like in TripAdvisor world, Google uses recency, frequency, in their rating, and take that into consideration. So in any Google search you do for hotels, the 3 or maybe 4 that show up in that map pack, it'll show what the star rating is and how many reviews that they have. So it's pretty easy to tell what that if that's having an impact. And that's not the only, I think that holds like a 13% ranking factor in that map pack, but you can pretty easily do any search you want and see if if you're getting more or less reviews than your comp set.
And I guess, as you said, just a simple, almost incognito search, just typing in a hotel for your location and see where your particular property comes up, or what is being shown in that search parameter.
Yeah, and and there's other things you can do to enhance that component, but if you don't have the budget, then maybe some of that stuff you can do on your own. But back to the budgeting scenario of it, you gotta have to say, if I've already got higher rating reviews and I've already got more volume, then I'm doing something right. I need to go and shift my focus somewhere else, versus having kind of a blanket strategy for what you used to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, this topic is, the point of this conversation is to kind of raise awareness to it. If anyone wants to dig deeper and get advice around it, well, they can reach out to you and engage, and you can talk them through it. But I think what I'm hearing to me from a layman's point of view, without the level of knowledge, expertise that you have, just seems very sensible. It's like in everyday life, isn't it? I've got a certain amount of money that I can spend. There's maybe slightly less money that I can spend now. What is going well? What isn't going so well? You've got a certain number of levers that you can pull, and it's just, okay, well, if I've got X amount of money, certain levers that I can pull where I can allocate that money, there should be a level of sophistication behind where I'm going to put that, rather than just saying, okay, the latest trend or the latest article I've read about is doing X. Let me get onto my digital marketing consultancy, give them a budget of a few $100s and tell them where to actually put it, rather than saying, well, hold on a minute, let's maybe first evaluate what you're doing well and what you're not doing so well.
Yeah, and I think that happens a lot, especially when people ask us to do any type of search and optimization. Like before you do anything, you got to take a baseline, you got to take a pulse. Where do you stand today before you can, adjust those KPIs and actually make any type of improvement on it. So it's, I feel like that first step in that is always kind of missed, because everyone's so in a rush to get those numbers into the software for approval, waiting for it to get hacked. And I think that's the other piece. Like if I go into it and I've already said, here's my baseline, and I know where it's a lot better, easier story to tell with ownership, because you've already got this. Here's where I am, and here's where I want to go. This is the gap I'm trying to close, and using these monies, I'm going to be able to close this gap. So it's much better than me like, hey, I want $5,000 a month to spend on like it's a better story to tell in terms of where you are and where you want to go.
Well, you've got the rationale behind why you're asking for that money, haven't you? Whereas sometimes you do feel it's a line on.
Last year. It's
like, well, it's this plus exactly a little bit more. It's a line on a spreadsheet, and it's like, yeah, okay, can we do that? And I think that's the point that struck me when we were first talking about this as a topic to cover, and particularly when you use the word audit, it's not like something new or exciting that obviously gets people attention, but when you actually break it down, my biggest fear, as I've shared with anybody that I speak to as we're coming out of this pandemic, is just this, human nature almost feels like water. We take the easiest path we possibly can, and so naturally it would be very easy to start reverting back to type. And resources have changed, competition has changed. What we can do within our property may have changed at the moment, which opens up a different comp set that we're competing against. So it just, to me, it seemed a very logical process, even if not a very sexy process to do, to say, okay, actually, let's just take stock before we go spending the money and the time to make sure we know what we're able to spend, where we're going to spend it, and then why we're spending it in those areas, because that drives back to something you said right at the very beginning, which is, well, how are you going to measure it? How are you going to know that you're having the impact? And sometimes you kind of get a sense that without that rationale behind it, you don't actually know what you're measuring. Do you see that, or is that just me talking a load of nonsense because I'm not an expert like you are?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And again, there's a process where you have to be able to show that you've closed that gap with the money that you've spent. And then, once you start having those conversations about, here's where we are, here's where we want to go, then you get a lot more buy-in, and you end up getting more money to spend anyways, because people understand your thought processes, versus just being like, okay, well, this is what we spent last year. Do we keep it in the budget or take it out? And I think the other point is, I hope at some point, because of all the change that you mentioned, that we somehow roll over to more of a rolling 12 months type plan, because like trying to ask me to plan for Q4 of 2022 right now, I mean.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to ask you, because traditionally when you do a budget, it's a 12-month budget. So I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, well, hold on. Okay, we all know budgeting is going to be challenging for this year anyhow, but how on earth can you expect to budget for Q1 and then budget for Q4 as if it's a straight line? I mean, it's just unrealistic, surely.
I know, and I think the other thing that I've talked about in previous ones is kind of having a tiered approach. So at some point, we hope group's going to come back. So if you have a plan for group, you need to have a plan, even if you don't know if you're executing it in Q1 or Q2 or Q3. You need to at least have a plan, so you can say, when do we start to see the signals? When do we start to see, this positive movement? Then we execute on X plan. So that bucket of whatever you want to do should be able to shift based on those triggers that we're seeing. Because as you know, like every 30 days, the entire world changes. So, like, do you have a plan in place for, weddings? So you still have to look at it from a segment standpoint and be ready to pull those triggers.
I've got
you. Just be able to stay agile, because, I've got a hotel right now they're like, we're behind the comp set, 5 occupancy points on Expedia. So we have to spend more to make up that gap. And that's where we see the biggest opportunity, because we have no organic exposure. So,
right.
And we're making that decision right now for this week. Nobody planned for that.
And I think you're right, because you can still roll those plans in to give you what you expect the budget is needed for the 12 months. But doing it, as you say, looking at it in different business segments. So you'd have a plan that when weddings come back online, this is what we will need to do. Groups business, as you say, if it's corporate business, because at the moment there's been a lot of leisure, whatever it may be, you build that plan in, but it doesn't necessarily just roll into a budget that maybe means that you divide up the total budget by 12 months. It might be that because of the nature of your property, I guess that there may be some, I'm probably saying the wrong thing here, but there may be some slightly lower budget spend in maybe Q1, because you're anticipating groups and weddings might start to come back in Q2, for instance. So you want to have a bigger budget to be able to drive into that business. Is that what you're talking about in terms of a tiered plan, but how the budget could reflect that tiering as well? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, because we can all be hopeful about when these particular segments are going to come, but we have to have another plan that says, if this doesn't happen, like, we got to be able to, we can do X, Y, Z. But it still goes back to that original, audit component. Like, do you already have exposure in the, in the wedding market? Have you already, exacerbated all your relationships to make sure that they're kind of doing that selling for you? So you really have to look at it and say, where do we stand now? And, are we going to be set if if we wake up January 1st and group comes back, like what, how are we positioned? And do we have a plan in place to be able to close that if we don't have good positioning? So I just think it makes it an easier conversation to have and to ask for money if you say, here's our problem areas. This is what I'm gonna do to fix them. And at the end of this time frame, this is this is the impact we can expect to see.
No, and I agree with you. I think what struck me, there's one word that really strikes me listening to you, because I'm sure you're having these conversations, when you're working with your clients, you're talking to the owners or the investors and trying to convince them to spend the money. And at the end of the day, that comes down to confidence. Do they have the confidence that if they release those funds, that they are going to be directed in the right way, that are likely to give some sort of return, and there's a plan as to how it's going to be spent and a way of measuring that it's having the impact. Now, if you just turn up and say, well, I want X and 10% more because that's what we did before, what level of confidence is that going to give? If you turn up having audited what you want to do and where you stand, and then put a much more targeted plan together, you may still be asking for the same sort of money, but because you can show how it's going to be used and why it's going to be used and how it's going to measure its impact, the likelihood of that there's still going to be a negotiation around how much, that's just normal. But the confidence, I would imagine someone is going to have to think, at least there is a sense of direction as to where this money is going to go. I would feel that's going to lean quite a long way into probably being able to get that budget signed off, or retain a higher amount of the budget that you were looking for.
Yes, and the word that you like that I said was impact, because a lot of times, if I say we're here at point A and we're gonna get to point C, a lot of times people don't care what happens in the middle to get from A to C. They only care about C, and the C is what impact did you make?
Yeah.
So if you can't quantify the impact that you made, then what's the whole point? If you can't come at the end and say this, but you can't determine what that impact was if you don't know what point A was.
Yeah,
so,
good point.
So whether we get there through Google Presence enhancements or OTA, a lot of times this gray matter doesn't matter as much. They just want to know, where am I going to be at the end, and what does that mean in terms of financials? And you can't do that again without knowing where you start.
That's a really good point. So an audit may not sound sexy, it may not sound exciting, but it sounds pretty crucial. That's brilliant.
You come with a better word than audit, don't I?
But it does what it does, doesn't it? It does what it says. Everyone knows what it actually means. But no,
I have a checklist that people can go through if they want to do it on their own. It's a 30-point online presence checklist. I don't give details, but basically it says these are the things you need to look at to determine, identify where those gaps or problems are. Because once you start kind of looking at it from a baseline standpoint on all these different places, it's quite telling. So I can share the 30 points so that you kind of give someone an initial starting point.
Absolutely. If you can share a link to that, if you can share a link, you mentioned there was a free tool. We'll also make sure that the link to the article that you wrote is in the notes, because we picked up some of the points from there as well. And that would be great. There'd be some great resources that people could pick up, and obviously, they can reach out to you direct if they want to engage and have a more detailed conversation. But I think that pretty much wraps up all the key bits that we were going to discuss. Is there anything that we've missed that's important to note, or have we got that nailed?
I think we're in good shape.
Very good. Brilliant. Well, look, as always a pleasure to talk with you. Always great to hear your advice, your insights, based on not only years of expertise, but you are in there, you're in the trenches, you're working with these branded properties day in, day out with you and your team. So what are the challenges that are being faced currently, and also how people are responding coming out. So if anyone wants to tap into that knowledge and advice, I know you're always there and accessible for someone to talk to. So thanks again for taking the time to join us today. It's really appreciated.
Thanks, Trevor.
Take care.
Well, I hope that conversation was of interest, and thanks again to Stephanie for joining us. If you have any thoughts or views on this discussion, please feel free to comment below. We always value your input. And if you like the discussion, please don't forget to give a thumbs up. I know every video asks for it, but by giving a thumbs up or subscribing, you help raise the profile of this channel, and in that way, you help us to help others. If you're interested in a recent video we did with Stephanie about marketing moving beyond ROI and ROAS, here it is. And if you're interested in more of our expert insights, here is our playlist. And finally, again, please don't forget to subscribe. Here is the button. Thanks again for watching.